On February 27th, 1992, 79-year-old Stella Liebeck of Albuquerque, New Mexico, ordered a 49-cent coffee at the window of a local McDonald's. She sat in the passenger seat of her grandson's car, which had no cup holders, and her grandson Chris parked the car so Stella could add cream and sugar to her coffee. She held the coffee cup between her knees and pulled the lid off. At this time, she spilled the entire cup of coffee into her lap. She was wearing cotton sweatpants, and the coffee soaked through the fabric and held it against her skin, burning her thighs, butt, and groin. The coffee was heated to 180 to 190 degrees. Thus begins the story of the infamous McDonald's hot coffee lawsuit. Stella was seen as a greedy old lady who got rich from suing McDonald's because her coffee was too hot. Doesn't everyone know that coffee is hot? How can we allow a person to get rich from such a stupid lawsuit? How stupid is it that McDonald's has to put a sticker on the cup warning that their coffee is hot? Stella went into shock and was taken to the hospital after the incident, where it was determined that she suffered third-degree burns on 6% of her skin and minor burns on more than 16%. Photos of Stella's leg and groin burns are easy to find on the internet, but are graphic. The burns were so bad that her labia were melted together. She was in the hospital for 8 days while under skin graft. During that time, she lost 20 pounds, which is almost 20% of her body weight, dropping her to 83 pounds. This terrible suffering was followed by 2 years of treatment. She suffered permanent disfigurement and was partially disabled for 2 years. Stella wrote to McDonald's asking for reimbursement for her out-of-pocket expenses, about $2,000, as well as the lost wages of her daughter who stayed home with her. McDonald's offered $800. McDonald's had a revenue of over $7 billion that year. When McDonald's refused to raise the offer, Stella hired Texas attorney Reed Morgan. He filed a lawsuit in the U.S. District Court of New Mexico accusing McDonald's of gross negligence for selling unreasonably dangerous and defectively manufactured coffee. Morgan offered to settle for $300,000, and a mediator offered $225,000. Just before trial, McDonald's refused both. He sought at least $100,000 in damages, including Stella's pain and suffering. McDonald's demanded immediate dismissal, defending the heat of its coffee and claiming that Stella spilled the coffee and was therefore the proximate cause of the injury. Document provided McDonald's operations and training manual said coffee should be brewed at 195 to 205 degrees and held at 180 to 190 degrees for optimal flavor. Company documents provided showed that over a decade, McDonald's received at least 700 reports of minor to third-degree coffee burns and settled more than $500,000 in scalding injuries. Stella said, "I picked up the cup and tried to get the top off. She looked for a place to put it down, but the dashboard was crooked. The car didn't have a cup holder. Both hands were busy. I couldn't hold it. I put it between my knees and tried to take the top off like that. Scalding coffee spilled into her lap. She screamed. Her grandson jumped out of the car to help her. She pulled on her hot sweatpants, squirming in the seat as the coffee seared her skin. What she remembered most was the pain. Danny Jarrett, a law student hired to measure coffee temperatures in other local restaurants. For comparison, sampled cups around the city and found that none were closer than about 20 degrees to the temperature at which McDonald's coffee is poured. Dr. Charles Baxter, a well-known burn expert at the Southwestern Medical School in Dallas, determined the graphic photos as evidence of Stella's charred skin and testified that coffee at 170 degrees would cause second-degree burns within 3.5 seconds of skin contact. A third-degree burn takes less than 3 seconds at 190 degrees. About 12 to 15 seconds at 180 degrees, and about 20 seconds at 160 degrees. Testimony from Christopher Appleton, a quality supervisor at McDonald's headquarters, said McDonald's knew that its coffee sometimes caused severe burns, but he had not consulted with burn experts on the matter. The company received 700 burn complaints over 10 years and did not decrease the heat after this. He admitted that the number of injuries was not high enough to prompt the company to review its practices. McDonald's coffee cups warn drinkers that the contents are hot, but the company chose not to warn customers about serious burns. McDonald's had no plans to change its coffee practices or policies, saying there are more serious dangers in restaurants. Robert Nafton, a safety consultant, claimed that the 700 complaints, about 1 in 24 million cups, was basically trivially different from zero. They argued any food hotter than 130 degrees can cause third-degree burns, so it doesn't matter if McDonald's coffee was hotter. Defense arguments: coffee was hot. It's what the customers want. Stella had only herself to blame. She was unwise to place the cup between her knees. Stella may have contributed to her injuries by not removing her clothes immediately. Her age may have caused her injuries to be worse than they would have been in a younger person. Because older skin is thinner and more susceptible to damage, the real question is, how far do you want society to go to limit what most of us enjoy and accept? Stella's lawyer asked a McDonald's director of quality control if he would recommend people drink coffee when it's 180 to 190 degrees. He casually says that no one should even think about drinking coffee when it's that hot because it can cause very terrible throat burns. Then he asks what he thinks about the hundreds of burns caused by McDonald's coffee. Incredibly, he insists that he is proud of those numbers because he thought they would be much higher. The lawsuit revealed that McDonald's knew that heating the coffee to such a temperature was dangerous, but they did it anyway because it would save them money. If you serve coffee that's too hot to drink, people will take much longer to drink, which means McDonald's won't have to give out as much free coffee. Also, heating it to such a level will produce the smell of freshly brewed coffee throughout the restaurant, incentivizing people to buy themselves a cup. The trial took place on August 8th to the 17th of 1994 before Judge Robert H. Scott of the District of New Mexico Court. He argued that coffee should never be served at hotter than 140 degrees and that many other establishments serve coffee at much lower temperatures than McDonald's. Lawyers presented evidence that coffee tested across the city was served at a temperature at least 20 degrees cooler than McDonald's coffee. They also presented the jury with expert testimony that coffee at 190 degrees can cause third-degree burns, where skin grafts are required in about 3 seconds. Lowering the temperatures to 160 degrees increases the time it takes for the coffee to burn the skin skin to about 20 seconds. Her lawyers argued that those extra seconds could allow for enough time to remove the coffee from exposed skin, preventing many burns. McDonald's argued that the reason for serving the coffee hot was that those who bought the coffee were usually commuters who wanted to travel with their coffee. The high initial temperature keeps the coffee warm during the journey. It turned out, however, that McDonald's conducted a survey showing that customers intended to drink coffee immediately while driving. Another reason McDonald's serves coffee so hot is due to advice from consultants that brewing at high temperatures are necessary to fully extract the taste. The jury returned its verdict on August 18, 1994, finding McDonald's 80% responsible and Stella 20%. Although the coffee cup had a warning, the jury decided that the warning was neither large nor sufficient. They awarded Stella $200,000 in damages, which were reduced by 20% to $160,000 for the 20% that she was deemed responsible. Note that this settlement would have never been reached if it happened in Maryland. Stella would not have received any money. To compensate for her horrific and shocking injuries inflicted at McDonald's, Maryland is one of the last remaining states that refuses to embrace the concept of comparative negligence. Instead, Maryland is stuck with the outdated and unfair concept of contributory negligence. If you are even 1% at fault for contributing to an accident or injury, you will not be compensated for your injuries, no matter how horrific. The jury also awarded Stella $2.7 million in damages, equivalent to over $5 million today. According to the New York Times, the jury decided on that figure, with the lawyers suggesting to penalize McDonald's for 2 days of coffee revenue, approximately $1.35 million per day. The judge reduced the punitive damages to $480,000, 3 times the compensation amount, for a total of $640,000. Both McDonald's and Stella appealed the decision in December of 1994, but both parties settled in court for an undisclosed amount. The Albuquerque Journal published the first story about the verdict, followed by the Associated Press, which was seen by newspapers around the world. Some call the case an example of a frivolous lawsuit. ABC News called the case the poster child of excessive lawsuits. Legal commentator Jonathan Turley called it a meaningful and worthy lawsuit. McDonald's claimed that the case was a fluke and the loss was caused by a poor communication and strategy by the insurance company representing the franchise. The child was defended, arguing that McDonald's lowered the temperature of its coffee after the suit, when in fact, McDonald's did not, showing they care more about profits than people, like most million-dollar companies. It was argued that McDonald's refusal to provide more than $800 in compensation for $1,500 in medical bills showed that the lawsuit was without merit, emphasizing the fact that Stella spilled coffee on herself and that the company had not committed any wrongdoing. They claim that the vast majority of judges considering similar cases dismiss them before they reach a jury. Stella passed away on August 5th, 2004 at the age of 91. According to her daughter, the burns and the lawsuit had taken their toll, and in the years following the settlement, Stella had no quality of life. She said the settlement paid for a live-in nurse. There was another McDonald's lawsuit in Florida after a 4-year-old girl suffered second-degree burns when a chicken nugget from her Happy Meal fell between her legs and seatbelt. McDonald's was found guilty of negligence in the case. case. And in July 2023, the now 8-year-old girl was awarded $800,000 in damages. According to a report published in 2007, McDonald's did not lower the temperature of its coffee, relying on stricter warnings on stiff styrofoam cups to avoid future injury and liability, although they continue to have more lawsuits over their hot coffee. However, in 2013, the New York Times reported that the coffee serving temperature was lowered by 10 degrees. The Specialty Coffee Association of America recommends better packaging methods instead of lowering the serving temperature of coffee. As of 2004, Starbucks was selling coffee at the same temperature, and the executive director of the Coffee Association of America reports that the standard serving temperature is 160 to 185 degrees. I can think of only a few things more horrific to me than elderly being hurt. This was a disturbing case for me to research. Alice Lynn Chamberlain Creighton, also known as Lindy, is a New Zealand-born Australian woman wrongfully convicted in one of Australia's most famous trials, accused of taking the life of her 9-week-old daughter, Azaria, while camping in 1980. She claimed she saw a dingo leave the tent where Azaria was sleeping. The prosecutor's case was circumstantial and relied on forensic evidence. Lindy was convicted in 1982, and her appeals to the federal court was circumstantial and relied on forensic evidence. Lindy was convicted in 1982, and her appeals to the federal and High Court of Australia were rejected. In 1986, after new evidence was discovered, clothing similar to what Azaria was wearing, Lindy was released from prison on parole. She and her husband, Michael Chamberlain, who were accused, were formally pardoned in 1987, and their convictions were overturned by the Supreme Court of Northern Territory in 1988. In 1992, the Australian government paid Chamberlain $1.3 million in compensation. In 2012, a fourth coroner ruled that Azaria passed as a result of a dingo attack. Lindy was born in 1948 in New Zealand. She moved to Australia with her family in 1969. She and her family were members of church, and she married a pastor that year. For the first 5 years of their marriage, they lived in Tasmania, then moving to Queensland. In the 1970s, Michael and Lindy had 2 sons, Aiden and Regan. Mrs. Ransom, an acquaintance of the family, said that Lindy always wanted a girl. Lindy's first daughter, Azaria, was born on June 11th, 1980. Her second daughter and fourth child, Kalia, was born 2 years later. When Azaria was 2 months old, the family went camping, arriving on August 16th, 1980. On the night of August 17th, Lindy reported that a dingo had taken her child from her tent. An extensive search was conducted. Azaria was not found, but the jumpsuit she was wearing was found about 4 kilometers from the tent about a week later, with blood stains around the neck indicating the likely passing of the missing child. From the day Azaria disappeared, Lindy and Michael said that a dingo took their child. At the start of the case, it was revealed that 2 years before Azaria disappeared, the park ranger Derek wrote to the government demanding that the dingo be hunted and warning of imminent human tragedy, stating that dingoes in the area had become increasingly aggressive, approaching and sometimes biting people. The Supreme Court overturned the results of the original investigation and ordered a second. They charged Lindy with taking the life of her daughter. Michael was later accused of being an accomplice. In 1982, they were both found guilty. As usual in cases where someone passes away under unusual or suspicious circumstances, a coroner's inquest was held to determine the manner and cause of passing. This found Azaria was taken by a dingo. Her parents, Michael and Lindy, had nothing to do with their child's disappearance. When they were charged, the coroner, who conducted a second inquest and requested findings on the cause and manner of Azaria's passing, said that while the evidence was largely circumstantial, a properly instructed jury could reach a verdict with regard to the clothing evidence. Campers Sally Lowe and Michael Chamberlain testified that they heard the baby cry while Lindy was with them at the barbecue, and Azaria is believed to have been in the family's tent. Witness Judith West, who was 30 meters away from the camp, testified that she heard the low growl of a dog coming from that direction, a sound she associated with the snarling of her husband's dogs when he slaughters sheep. Lindy testified that in response to others hearing Azaria crying, she went to the tent. Halfway to the tent, she thought she saw a dingo having difficulty getting out of the tent and shaking its head vigorously. Her view of its snout was obscured. She shouted, "Michael, Michael, the dingo's got my baby," and ran to the tent to see Azaria was missing. She ran in the direction she thought the dingo had gone and yelled to her husband for a flashlight. Police Detective Sergeant John Lincoln testified that he photographed large paw prints a few inches from Azaria's cot and found what was likely to be blood outside of the tent. He collected samples, but they were not tested. Sally also testified that she led Lindy's son, Reagan, out of the tent after the event. While in the tent, she noticed a pool of blood. Another witness who entered the tent that night, Police Constable Frank Morris, testified that there were only a few drops of blood on the tent blankets and sleeping bags. A forensic witness found blood on the tent wall. Researcher Dr. Andrew Scott agreed that the blood splatter trail was consistent with a dingo carrying a bleeding child. However, he did not believe it was human blood. Dog hair was in the tent and on Azaria's jumpsuit. The family did not have a dog. Les Harris, the president of the Dingo Foundation, testified that it was his opinion, based on years of dingo research, that the dingo may have covered the child's head in its mouth and carried the child's weight for long distances. He took photographs of dingoes wrapping a doll's head between their jaws. However, forensic expert Professor James Cameron testified that this was impossible based on the examination of plaster casts on dingo's jaws. It was impossible for a dingo to open its jaws wide enough to cover the baby's head. Witness tourist Max Whittaker had participated in the search later on the night of the disappearance. He claimed that the head ranger called to help him follow dingo paw prints and drag marks in the sand. He followed tracks of a dingo carrying a heavy object believed to be Azaria Although experts disagreed on whether the clothing damage could have been caused by a dingo, some believe it could. In addition, the marks on the diaper fragments were similar to marks made by a dingo on a diaper in a test. Azaria's clothes were found only 30 meters deep in a dingo cave, although no one, including the warden and his deputy, knew about the cave at the time. Some evidence suggests human intervention between the time the clothes were found and when the police photographed them. Camper Wallace Goodwin, who was the first to find the jumpsuit and diaper, said that the entire jumpsuit was undone. Her shirt was next to the jumpsuit, not inside it, and the clothes were lying on the ground naturally, not if they were placed there. But Police Constable Frank Morris, the first officer to examine the clothes after Goodwin found them, testified that only the top 4 buttons were undone and the shirt was inside the jumpsuit. He said he took the clothes to check for human remains inside, then returned them to the ground and photographed them. The shirt was inside out. Lindy testified that she always made sure her shirts were not inside out. It was speculated that the Chamberlains knew that dingoes were in the area and tried to simulate a dingo attack, found her body, removed her clothing, damaged it by cutting it, rubbed it onto a plant, and placed it to be found later. Based on this and unidentified blood evidence found in the couple's car, they were charged and convicted of taking the life of their 2-month-old baby. Lindy was sentenced to life in prison without parole, and Michael was sentenced to 3 years for accessory to the crime. It was later determined that the stain believed to be blood found in the car was likely paint from the manufacturing production. Theorized that within 5 to 10 minutes of leaving the campfire, Lindy returned to the tent, did everything she could to stop her young son Aiden from following her, changed into sweatpants and took Azaria into her car and used scissors to cut Azaria's neck, waited for her to pass, hid the body in the camera bag in the car, cleaned all the blood, changed out of her sweatpants, brought her son baked beans from the car, returned to the tent, did something to leave blood splatter there, and brought her son Aiden back to the fire, at the time attracting the attention of other campers. Greg Lowe, who admitted he saw Lindy go into the tent with Aiden and Azaria and then walk to her car, her left arm around her son Aiden and her right arm free. She counted on her son not realizing that she had taken Azaria and had returned without her, openly asking where she had taken Azaria. She later returned to the tent and immediately claimed to have seen a dingo take her child, suggesting that her claiming it to have been a dingo be purely coincidence. Anyone who didn't notice the alleged blood on Lindy's clothes in the hours after disappearance was pure luck. Her opening the car where the body was allegedly hidden, where the police dog could smell Azaria, was a bold risk. Either she did it somehow without her husband's knowledge, or he was incredibly daring to leave his children in her care and told police that he gave them the wrong camera bag and then gave one that was used to hide the body. This theory is flawed for several reasons, but most notably, all the experts said that the bloodstains on Azaria's jumpsuit showed no arterial bleeding, and it would have taken up to 20 minutes for her to pass from this wound if her carotid was cut. Further examination of the clothing evidence showed it was buried before it was found and presumably contained the child's body when it was buried. The pH value of the clothing corresponds to the soil type of the camp. inconsistent with the pH in the soil where the clothing was found. There are no signs of dragging or catching, and there was no saliva on the clothing. It was argued that the absence of saliva was not significant when the witness reported heavy rain in the area. The clothes were not exposed to heavy rain because there is evidence that such heavy rain would have adversely affected the blood staining of the clothes, but that is not the case. This lack of saliva and dragging is consistent with the dingo carrying the body for about 4 kilometers. The jumpsuit was completely done up by studs to the neck, which remained closed while the child was bleeding. Once the blood had dried, the top 2 studs were undone before the clothes were buried while the child was wearing them. Fluorescence examination shows the presence of a palm print of the right hand of a small adult, and some evidence of the left hand was caused by someone holding the child while their hands were bloody. Individual holes or indentations visible in the clothing may be consistent with animal tooth marks, but the absence of tissue stains associated with these holes is inconsistent with the animal carrying the child, suggesting the evidence clearly shows that the clothing was cut and torn in places by a person, and in particular the cut on the collar was made after the blood had been smeared. It has been suggested that one area of injury on the elbow may be consistent with animal bites, but there is very strong evidence that the bite marks would be inconsistent, as there is no evidence of tissue staining that would be necessary if the animal damaged the clothing. Plant staining on the clothing is inconsistent with the vegetation found at the scene and the likely contamination that would have occurred if an animal dragged the body. This supports the view that the plant staining was deliberately caused by a human. The clothing found was not scattered in the area, which contradicts that an animal was responsible for its placement. The clothing was found near the base of a path next to a dingo cave. Scissors were found in Lindy's car that had human fetal blood on them. There is evidence that similar scissors were used to cut the clothing. Based on this evidence, it was concluded that both parents were involved in covering up their crime. The prosecutor's forensic testimony included forensic evidence. Scientist James Cameron, who also gave important testimony in the case in England, which was later retracted when his testimony was proven false. It was argued that the parents convinced fellow camper and witness Sally Lowe to say that she heard Azaria cry after Lindy returned to the campfire, as this evidence would prove their entire story that Lindy took the life of her child in her car and never returned with her false. I don't know about y'all, but all the smart people phrasing of cases is too much for simple-minded me to comprehend. Soon after the conviction, Lindy was escorted out of prison under guard to give birth to her 4th child, Kelia, then taken back to prison. 2 appeals to her sentence were rejected. New evidence emerged 6 years later when Azaria's jacket, which police claimed did not exist, was found partially buried next to a dingo nest in a remote location near the camp. 5 days later, Lindy was released from prison and her life sentence was overturned. In 1982, a Royal Commission began to investigate the matter in more detail. The Royal Commission concluded that there was reasonable doubt of the guilt of the Chamberlains. The crime was not proven beyond reasonable doubt, although the commission thought that the evidence sustainably supported the dingo hypothesis. It did not examine the evidence to see if it was proven that the dingo had taken the child. In the 1988 acquittal of the Chamberlains, the Supreme Court held that the alleged baby blood found in the car, which the prosecution relied heavily on, could be any substance, but it was probably a sound deadening compound from production overspray, which did not contain blood. That finding highlighted inconsistencies in an earlier blood test, which, along with the jacket later recovered from the dingo den. The court also noted that DNA testing was not advanced in the early 1980s. The prosecution expert testimony was admissible evidence at the time, although it was ultimately found to be faulty. The Supreme Court acquitted the Chamberlains in September 1988. The Chamberlains continued to seek resolution that the case of their daughter's passing was one or more dingoes without human intervention. New evidence of dingo attacks on babies and young children helped convince the coroner to reopen the inquest. After 32 years of intense media interest and public condemnation, the Chamberlains announced that they were still not satisfied with the acquittal and assumed innocence, and wanted to know once and for all how their daughter passed away. In 2012, the coroner gave the final verdict that a dingo took baby Azaria Chamberlain from the camp in 1980 and caused her to lose her life. The Chamberlains divorced in 1991. They received $1.3 million in compensation in 1992. So a dingo really did eat her baby. In the mid-1990s, Pepsi faced competition from Coca-Cola and tried to attract a younger audience. In March 1996, Pepsi launched the Pepsi Stuff campaign, which allows customers to collect Pepsi points that can be redeemed for items such as t-shirts and leather jackets. These points can be earned by purchasing Pepsi products with labels attached to the packaging. The campaign was the largest in Pepsi history. To promote the campaign, Pepsi released a series of television commercials. One of these ads features a computer-generated Pepsi-branded jet. The commercial offering the jet for 7 million Pepsi points caught the attention of 21-year-old business student John Leonard. In place of a label, the campaign allowed Pepsi points to be purchased directly at 10 cents per point. Leonard noticed this detail, which convinced 5 investors to lend him a total of $700,000. Leonard sent a check for $700,000 and $8.50, including $10 shipping and handling and 15 labels per promotion rules. Pepsi rejected the offer, citing the ad's promotion of the jet as fanciful and claiming it was intended to create a humorous and entertaining ad.
Introducing the new Pepsi Stuff catalog. Now, the more Pepsi you drink, the more great stuff you're going to get.
Sure beats the bus.
The claim alleged both breach of contract and fraud. The case was originally filed in Florida but was later heard in New York. Leonard claimed that a federal judge was incapable of deciding on the matter and that instead the decision had to be made by a jury consisting of members of the Pepsi generation to whom the advertisement would allegedly allegedly constitute an offer. The court rejected Lennard's claims and denied recovery on several grounds, including it was found that the advertisement with the jet was not an offer. The court ruled that no reasonable person would have believed that the company seriously intended to send a jet for $700,000 worth of approximately $37.4 million, meaning that it was just a sham. The value meant that it fell within the statute of frauds, but the statute's requirement of a written statement between the parties was not met, so a contract had not been formed. After giving reasons for its conclusion that the ad was obviously made for fun and the idea of riding a jet to school is an exaggerated teenage fantasy, the court made several observations about the nature and content of the ad, including the troubled teenager in the ad is a highly unlikely pilot who can hardly be trusted with the keys of his parents' cars, let alone a prized U.S. Marine Corps aircraft. The comment by the teenager who flies the jet to school of sure beats the bus shows an unlikely indifference to the relative difficulty and danger of operating a fighter jet in a residential area. No school would give a student a landing pad for a fighter jet or tolerate the disruption that the use of the jet would cause. The court also noted that the model of the jet's well-documented function is to attack and destroy ground and air targets, and offensive and anti-aircraft warfare. Describing such an aircraft as a way to get to school in the morning is obviously not serious, even if the plaintiff claims the aircraft can be obtained in a form that eliminates its potential for military use. Pepsi never cashed the check John sent, so there was no case for fraud. Pepsi continued to air the ad, but updated the price of the jet to 700 million Pepsi points and added the disclaimer, "Just kidding." The Pentagon stated that the Harrier jet would not be sold to civilians without demilitarization, which in the case of Harrier would include stripping its ability of vertical landing and takeoff. A docu-series was released in 2022 on Netflix about the case, titled Pepsi, Where's My Jet?